A Christian revival or revivalism is increased spiritual interest or renewal in the life of a church congregation or society, with a local, national or global effect. This should be distinguished from the use of the term revival to refer to an evangelistic meeting, a series of meetings. Revivals are seen as the restoration of the church itself to a vital and fervent relationship with God after a period of moral decline. Mass conversions of non-believers are viewed by church leaders as having positive moral effects. Within Christian studies, the concept of revival is derived from biblical narratives of national decline and restoration during the history of the Israelites. In particular, narrative accounts of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah emphasize periods of national decline and revival associated with the rule of various righteous and wicked kings. Josiah is notable within this biblical narrative as a figure who reinstituted temple worship of Yahweh while destroying pagan worship. Within modern church history, church historians have identified and debated the effects of various national revivals within the history of the USA and other countries. During the 18th and 19th centuries, American society experienced a number of awakenings around the years 1727, 1792, 1830, 1857 and 1882. More recent revivals in the 20th century include those of the 1904–1905 Welsh Revival, 1906, 1930s, 1970s, 1971 Barrio Revival and 1909 Chile Revival, which spread in the Americas, Africa, and Asia among Protestants and Catholics. National revival within Jewish history. The Bible narrative records a number of revivals within the history of the Israelites. In particular, following the development of temple worship based in Jerusalem, the Bible records periods of national decline and revival associated with the rule of righteous and wicked kings. Within this historical narrative, the reign of Josiah epitomizes the effect of revival on Israelite society in reinstituting temple worship of Yahweh, and the rejection of pagan worship and idolatry. Other Jewish narratives, such as the accounts of the Maccabean revolt, in like manner record national revival characterized by the rejection of pagan worship practices and the military defeat and expulsion of idolatrous foreign powers. Revivals within modern church history. 17th century. Many Christian revivals drew inspiration from the missionary work of early monks for the Protestant Reformation and from the uncompromising stance of the Covenanters in 17th century Scotland and Ulster, that came to Virginia and Pennsylvania with Presbyterians and other nonconformists. Its character formed part of the mental framework that led to the American War of Independence and the Civil War. 18th century. The 18th century Age of Enlightenment had a chilling effect on spiritual movements, but this was countered by the Methodist revival of John Wesley, Charles Wesley and George Whitefield in England, and Daniel Rowland, Howell Harris and William Williams, Pantycelyn in Wales, and the Great Awakening in America prior to the Revolution. A similar revival in Scotland took place at Cambuslang, then a village, and is known as the Cambuslang work. A new fervour spread within the Anglican Church at the end of the century, when the evangelical party of John Newton, William Wilberforce and his Clapham sect were inspired to combat social ills at home and slavery abroad, and founded Bible and missionary societies. American colonies. In the American colonies, the First Great Awakening was a wave of religious enthusiasm among Protestants that swept the American colonies in the 1730s and 1740s, leaving a permanent impact on American religion. It resulted from powerful preaching that deeply affected listeners with a deep sense of personal guilt and salvation by Christ, pulling away from ritual and ceremony. The Great Awakening made religion intensely personal to the average person by creating a deep sense of spiritual guilt and redemption. Historian Sidney E. Ahlstrom sees it as part of a great international Protestant upheaval that also created pietism in Germany, the evangelical revival, and Methodism in England. It brought Christianity to the slaves and was an apocalyptic event in New England that challenged established authority. It incited rancor and division between the old traditionalists who insisted on ritual and doctrine and the new revivalists. It had a major impact in reshaping the Congregational, Presbyterian, Dutch Reformed, and German Reformed denominations, and strengthened the small Baptist and Methodist denominations. It had little impact on Anglicans and Quakers. Unlike the Second Great Awakening that began about 1800 and which reached out to the unchurched, the First Great Awakening focused on people who were already church members. It changed the rituals, the piety, and the self-awareness. The new style of sermons and the way people practiced the faith breathed new life into religion in America. People became passionately and emotionally involved in the religion, rather than passively listening to intellectual discourse in a detached manner. Ministers who used this new style of preaching were generally called New Lights, while the preachers of old were called Old Lights. People began to study the Bible at home, which effectively decentralized the means of informing the public on religious matters and was akin to the individualistic trends present in Europe. During the Protestant Reformation, 19th century, Transylvania, the Hungarian Baptist Church sprung out of revival with the perceived liberalism of the Hungarian Reformed Church during the late 1800s. Many thousands of people were baptized in a revival that was led primarily by uneducated laymen, the so-called peasant prophets. Britain. During the 18th century, England saw a series of Methodist revivalist campaigns that stressed the tenets of faith set forth by John Wesley and that were conducted in accordance with a careful strategy. In addition to stressing the evangelist combination of Bible, cross-conversion, and activism, the revivalist movement of the 19th century made efforts toward a universal appeal, rich and poor, urban and rural, men and women. Special efforts were made to attract children and to generate literature to spread the revivalist message. Gobbett discusses the usefulness of historian Eli Halevy's thesis explaining why England did not undergo a social revolution in the period 1790 to 1832, a time that appeared ripe for violent social upheaval. Halevy suggested that a politically conservative Methodism forestalled revolution among the largely uneducated working class by redirecting its energies towards spiritual rather than temporal affairs. The thesis has engendered strong debate among historians, and several have adopted and modified Halevy's thesis. Some historians, such as Robert Weymouth, suggest that evangelical revivalism directed working-class attention toward moral regeneration, not social radicalism. Others, including E. P. Thompson, claim that Methodism, though of small movement, had a politically regressive effect on efforts for reform. Some historians question the Halevy thesis. Eric Hobsbawm claims that Methodism was not a large enough movement to have been able to prevent revolution. Alan Gilbert suggests that Methodism's supposed anti-radicalism has been misunderstood by historians, suggesting that it was seen as a socially deviant movement and the majority of Methodists were moderate radicals. Early in the 19th century, the Scottish minister Thomas Chalmers had an important influence on the evangelical revival movement. Chalmers began life as a moderate in the Church of Scotland and an opponent of evangelicalism. During the winter of 1803–04, he presented a series of lectures that outlined a reconciliation of the apparent incompatibility between the Genesis account of creation and the findings of the developing science of geology. However, by 1810 he had become an evangelical and would eventually lead the disruption of 1843 that resulted in the formation of the Free Church of Scotland. The Plymouth Brethren started with John Nelson Darby at this time, a result of disillusionment with denominationalism and clerical hierarchy. The established churches, too, were influenced by the evangelical revival. In 1833, a group of Anglican clergymen led by John Henry Newman and John Keble began the Oxford movement. However, its objective was to renew the Church of England by reviving certain Roman Catholic doctrines and rituals, thus distancing themselves as far as possible from evangelical enthusiasm. Australia. Many say that Australia has never been visited by a genuine religious revival as in other countries, but that is not entirely true. The effect of the Great Awakening of 1858–59 was also felt in Australia, fostered mainly by the Methodist Church, one of the greatest forces for evangelism and missions the world has ever seen. Records show that the Methodist Church grew by a staggering 72% between 1857 and 1864, while the Baptists, Anglicans, Presbyterians and other evangelicals also benefited. Evangelical fervor was its height during the 1920s, with visiting evangelists R.A. Torrey, Wilbur J. Chapman, Charles M. Alexander and others winning many converts in the Crusades. The Crusades of American evangelist Billy Graham in the 1950s had significant impact on Australian churches. Stuart Piggin explores the development and tenacity of the evangelical movement in Australia and its impact on Australian society. Evangelicalism arrived from Britain as an already mature movement characterized by commonly shared attitudes toward doctrine, spiritual life, and sacred history. Any attempt to periodize the history of the movement in Australia should examine the role of revivalism and the oscillations between emphases on personal holiness and social concerns. Scandinavia. Historians have examined the revival movements in Scandinavia, with special attention to the growth of organizations, church history, missionary history, social class and religion, women in religious movements, religious geography, the lay movements as counterculture, ethnology, and social force. Some historians approach it as a cult process, since the revivalist movements tend to rise and fall. Others study it as minority discontent with the status quo after the revivalists gain wide acceptance, as a majority that tends to impose its own standards. The Grundtvigian and Home Mission revival movements arose in Denmark after 1860 and reshaped religion in that country, and among immigrants to America. In the U.S., the Second Great Awakening was the second great religious revival in United States history and consisted of renewed personal salvation, experienced in revival meetings. Major leaders included Asahel Nettleton, James Brainerd Taylor, Charles Grandison Finney, Lyman Beecher, Barton Stone, Alexander Campbell, Peter Cartwright and James B. Finley. Rev. Charles Finney was a key leader of the evangelical revival movement in America. From 1821 onwards he conducted revival meetings across many northeastern states and won many converts. For him, a revival was not a miracle but a change of mindset that was ultimately a matter for the individual's free will. His revival meetings created anxiety in a penitent's mind that one could only save his or her soul by submission to the will of God. As as illustrated by Finney's quotations from the Bible. Finney also conducted revival meetings in England, first in 1849 and later to England and Scotland in 1858–59. In New England, the renewed interest in religion inspired a wave of social activism, including abolitionism. In the West, especially at Cane Ridge, Kentucky, and in Tennessee, the revival strengthened the Methodists and Baptists. The Churches of Christ and Christian Church arose from the Stone Campbell Restoration movement. It also introduced into America a new form of religious expression, the Scottish camp meeting. Europe, Le Réveillé movement in Swiss, Eastern French, German, and Dutch Protestant history known as Le Réveil. Le Réveil was a revival of Protestant Christianity along conservative evangelical lines at a time when rationalism had taken a strong hold in the churches on the continent of Europe. In German-speaking Europe, Lutheran Johann Georg Hamann was a leading light in the new wave of evangelicalism, the Erweckung, which spread across the land, cross-fertilizing with British movements. The movement began in the Francophone world in connection with a circle of pastors and seminarians at French-speaking Protestant theological seminaries in Geneva, Switzerland and Montauban, France, influenced inter alia by the visit of Scottish Christian Robert Haldane in 1816–17. The circle included such figures as Mulder Orbine, Circuit Sar Malin, Felix Neff, and the Menard brothers. As these men traveled out, the movement spread to Lyon and Paris in France, to Berlin and Elberfeld in Germany, and to the Netherlands. Several missionary societies were founded to support this work, such as the British-based Continental Society and the indigenous Geneva Evangelical Society, as well as supporting existing Protestant denominations. In France and Germany, the movement led to the creation of free evangelical church groupings, the Union des Églises Evangeliques Libres and Bund für evangelische Gemeinden in Deutschland. In the Netherlands, the movement was taken forward by Willem Bilderdijk, with Isaac da Costa, Abraham Cupados, Samuel Yperus Wiselius, Willem de Klerk and Groot van Pristra as his pupils. The movement was politically influential and actively involved in improving society, and, at the end of the 19th century, brought about anti-revolutionary and Christian historical parties. At the same time in Britain, figures such as William Wilberforce and Thomas Chalmers were active, although they are not considered to be part of the Le Réveil movement. In North America, the Third Great Awakening began from 1857 onwards in Canada and spread throughout the world, including America and Australia. Significant names include Dwight L. Moody, Ira D. Sankey, William Booth and Catherine Booth, Charles Spurgeon and James Corey. Hudson Taylor began the China Inland Mission, and Thomas John Bernardo founded his famous orphanages. Representative was Rev. James Corey, an American sent by the Wesleyan Methodist Church to Canada from the 1840s through 1864. He brought in the converts by the score, most notably in the revivals in Canada West 1851–53. His technique combined restrained emotionalism with a clear call for personal commitment, coupled with follow-up action to organize support from converts. It was a time when the holiness movement caught fire, with the revitalized interest of men and women in Christian perfection. Corey successfully bridged the gap between the style of earlier camp meetings and the needs of more sophisticated Methodist congregations in the emerging cities. In England, the Keswick Convention movement began out of the British holiness movement, encouraging a lifestyle of holiness, unity and prayer. Subsequently, the period 1880 to 1903 has been described as a period of unusual evangelistic effort and success, and again sometimes more of a resurgence of the previous wave. Moody, Sankey and Spurgeon are again notable names. Others included Sam Jones, J. Wilbur Chapman and Billy Sunday in North America, Andrew Murray in South Africa, William Irvine in Ireland, and John McNeill in Australia. The Faith Mission began in 1886. 1857 to 1860 Revival in America. On the 21st of September 1857, Jeremiah Lanphier, a businessman, began a series of prayer meetings in New York. By the beginning of 1858, the congregation was crowded, often with a majority of businessmen. Newspapers reported that over 6,000 were attending various prayer meetings in New York, and 6,000 in Pittsburgh. Daily prayer meetings were held in Washington, D.C. at 5 different times to accommodate the crowds. Other cities followed the pattern. Soon, a common midday sign on business premises read, "We will reopen at the close of the prayer meeting." By May, 50,000 of New York's 800,000 people were new converts. Finney wrote of this revival, "This winter of 1857 to 58 will be remembered as the time when a great revival prevailed. It swept across the land with such power that at the time it was estimated that not less than 50,000 conversions occurred weekly." Britain and Ireland. In 1857, 4 young Irishmen began a weekly prayer meeting in the village of Connor near Ballymena. See also Huckle. This meeting is generally regarded as the origin of the 1859 Ulster revival that swept through most of the towns and villages throughout Ulster and, in due course, brought 100,000 converts into the churches. It was also ignited by a young preacher, Henry Grattan Guinness, who drew thousands at a time to hear his preaching. So great was the interest in the American movement that in 1858 the Presbyterian General Assembly meeting in Derry appointed 2 of the ministers, Dr. William Gibson and Rev. William McClure, to visit North America. Upon the return, the 2 deputies had many public opportunities to bear testimony to what they had witnessed of the remarkable outpouring of the Spirit across the Atlantic, and to fan the flames in the homeland yet further. Such was the strength of emotion generated by the preacher's oratory that many made spontaneous confessions seeking to be relieved of the burdens of sin. Others suffered complete nervous breakdown. 20th century. The final Great Awakening had its roots in the holiness movement which had developed in the late 19th century. The Pentecostal revival movement began out of a passion for more power and a greater outpouring of the Holy Spirit. In 1902, the American evangelists Reuben Archer Torrey and Charles McCarlin Alexander conducted meetings in Melbourne, Australia, resulting in more than 8,000 converts. News of this revival traveled fast, igniting a passion for prayer and an expectation that God would work in similar ways elsewhere. Torrey and Alexander were involved in the beginnings of the Great Welsh Revival. In 1906, the modern Pentecostal movement was born in Azusa Street, in Los Angeles, Melanesia. The Revival, as it is known in Tok-Pisin, had begun in the Solomon Islands and reached the European people by 1977. The European were particularly zealous in rejecting the traditional beliefs, and adopted a form of charismatic Christianity based on Baptist Christianity. The European innovated the practices of spirit possession and ritualized confessions, the latter being especially atypical for Protestantism. Wales. The Welsh Revival was not an isolated religious movement but very much a part of Britain's modernisation. The revival began in the fall of 1904 under the leadership of Evan Roberts, a 26-year-old former collier and minister in training. The revival lasted less than a year, but in that period 100,000 converts were made. Begun as an effort to kindle non-denominational, non-sectarian spirituality, the Welsh Revival of 1904-05 coincided with the rise of the labour movement, socialism, and a general disaffection with religion among the working class and youths. Placed in context, the short-lived revival appears as both a climax for nonconformism and a flashpoint of change in Welsh religious life. The movement spread to Scotland and England, with estimates that 1 million people were converted in Britain. Missionaries subsequently carried the movement abroad. It was especially influential on the Pentecostal movement emerging in California. Unlike earlier religious revivals that pivoted on powerful preaching, the revival of 1904–05 relied primarily on music and on paranormal phenomena as exemplified by the visions of Evan Roberts. The intellectual emphasis of the earlier revivals had left a dearth of religious imagery that the visions supplied. They also challenged the denial of the spiritual and miraculous element of Scripture by opponents of the revival, who held liberal and critical theological positions. The structure and content of the visions not only repeated those of Scripture and earlier Christian mystical tradition but also illuminated the personal and social tensions that the revival addressed by juxtaposing biblical images with scenes familiar to contemporary Welsh believers. There are also claims that another revival is occurring in parts of Wales and northern England throughout 2013 and 2014. Revival hymns. Following the Protestant Reformation, from about 1700 to 1850, many nonconformist churches produced lively popular hymns that expressed one's personal relationship with God. Later hymns were written in a movement called revivalist. Songs such as "Washed in the Blood of the Lamb" came from Moody and Sankey's hymn book. The churches which promoted these songs were generally followers of literal interpretations of the Bible, temperance-inclined and often Baptist, Methodist, or holiness and what are called conservative Mennonites today. Rev. Dr. William McCrae, a Free Presbyterian minister from Northern Ireland, has also released a song called "Revival Days."